snows have passed, the winter's gone. Beautiful flowers grow too big for my love. Spring is here, flowers are ripe, giving their fragrant signs of life. Spring, 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 begins the life of love. Spring, 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 awakes the hearts of men. Birds chirp their song, I sing along, feeling the sweet air profoundly with sound. Those ring of fire, aging my love, filling her heart with sounds of spring. Spring, 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 begins the life of love. Spring, 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 awakes the hearts of men.
Hello, bros. We're back with Heinz Ewers. This is Vampire. This is Chapter 9, Selenites, whatever it is. Here is an invitation from Miss Pierpont, Ernst Rosius said as he opened the mail, for a party of the Moon ladies. You said you were going to take me there. Let me see, Frank Braun said, reaching for the envelope. He shook his head as he read the engraved card. Good heavens, they can't even give an original party in this parrot city. Look, Rosius, 28 January A.D. 1490. This is a literal translation of an invitation from Duke Rimoff and the party of the Moon ladies. Will probably be a cheap imitation of the entertainment which the Duke gave in Paris 5 or 6 years ago. It will hardly be worthwhile going. Were you at that party in Paris? The secretary asked. No, but Miss Pierpont was, and she told me how marvelous it was. The idea is that the abbess of San Sixto of the order of Saint Dominicus of Guzman gives a feast for Caesar Borgia to celebrate his return to Rome. Hello, bros. The details were taken from the diary of Burchard, who was master of ceremonies to Alexander VI. It may have been all right in Paris, but I can imagine how terrible it will be here. Can you picture Renaissance at Miss Pierpont's in New York? Ernst Rosius's face fell. You don't want to go, doctor, but you said it would be very good for me to see one of the orgies that these ladies give. Frank Braun laughed. Very good for you. I am not sure if it would be so good for your morals, but it will interest you. Have we anything for that night? Not a thing. I looked up your appointments. No speeches, no theater, not even a dinner invitation. This is Vampire by Heinz Ewers. Not a thing. I looked up your appointments. No speeches, no theater, not even a dinner invitation. All right, let's go then. Write her a note that I shall be very glad to accept and ask her for permission to bring you. Wait a minute. Here's the list from which we can select our costumes. Papal guards, Spanish court costume, French and Venetian ambassadors here. All right, let's see if we can get this going again. Fucking YouTube app sucks. All right, let's go then. Write her a note that I shall be very glad to accept and ask her for permission to bring you. Wait a minute. Here is the list from which we can select our costumes. Papal guards, Spanish court costumes, French and Venetian ambassadors. Here, Franciscan friars, that will do. That is the simplest. You will see something in the way of costumes. Call up the German theater and ask them to lend us a couple of friars' habits that aren't too moth-eaten. They arrived late, the solemn reception was over, and the abbess Benedicta was just escorting her illustrious guest, the Pope's nephew, to the refectory where the entertainment was to take place. The refectory was the great hall of the clubhouse. The glass partitions which separated it from an enormous solarium had been removed for this night so as to give the effect of one immense room opening out into a garden. There was no indication, of course, that the guests were supposed to be in the room of a convent. Everything that had to do with religion had been carefully avoided in the decoration of the hall. There was no crucifix, no statue of the Virgin or of a saint, no religious pictures. The large hall, with its dark red tapestries, dimly lighted by covered lights from the ceiling, could house anything. A rococo dance or a banquet from the Arabian Nights. There is Director Andre, Rosia said. So you are a friar too, Frank Braun smiled. A Dominican at that. That's unfair competition. I am Savonarola, Andre answered. I have come from San Marco in Florence to gather material here for my sermons. There was no house in New York or in the whole United States that would not be glad to welcome this man. Society fondly remembered him as the famous tenor of the Metropolitan, who later was chosen director of the opera and who had ruled the artistic life of the city for many years. Now he had 3 musical comedies on the road and a share in every other amusement enterprise, in the moving pictures, in vaudeville, and the circus. This is Vampire by Heinz Ewers. Come, gentlemen, Andre suggested. Let's go over and stand on the platform, where we can see the show better. A platform with steps leading up to it had been built around 3 sides of the room. And there the guests assembled now, costumed lackeys, stood behind the red and gold chairs, and in the center was the magnificent throne of the abbess, Just as the men were taking their places, the abbess, in her solemn black and white habit, was led to her throne by Caesar Borgia. Go to sleep then, bruvs. A platform with steps. I already read that, didn't I? Susan Pierpont looks well, Frank Braun commented, but who is her handsome Caesar? Is that Caesar or Caesar? Caesar? A girl of 12 sat down at the feet of the abbess, Caesar's pretty little sister, Lucretia Borgia. As the guests walked up the steps to take their places on the platform, a herald announced their names with a flourish of trumpets. Beside the abbess sat the Pope's mistresses, a woman in her 40s who played the role of Caesar's mother, Vanaza, and young Julie Farnese with her husband, the Prince of Orsini. Julia Farnese was played by Miss Pierpont's intimate friend, Marion de Fox. Behind her stood the Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, and next to him the Pope's Master of Ceremonies, Burchard. There was the Cardinal's mistress, Adriana Mila, and Cesar's sister, Isabella and Girolama. Girolama was played by Miss Marlborough, the third in the Pierpont triumvirate. known in Paris as well as in New York. Geoffrey Borgia was there, and Giovanni di Celano, and Pier Luigi, in fact, all the 9 children of the powerful Pope Rodrigo, who called himself Alexander the Sixth. Even the smallest children of the Pope had not been forgotten. Little Laura and Giovanni, whom Julia Farnese had borne him. Whom Julia Farnese had borne him. It's clunky. Julia Farnese held the little girl in her lap while Giovanni sat with the woman who represented the Pope's mistress, Vanazza. Only the Pope himself was not there. No, that would never do. One had to make concessions there, but all his nephews and relatives were there. Don Geoffrey's wife, Sancia, the bishops Colorando and Francesco Borgia, Luigi Pietro Borgia, who was the cardinal deacon of Santa Maria, and the captain of the papal guard, Rodrigo Borgia, even the privy councillor, Juan Moradas, bishop of Toul, was there looking magnificently real in his costume, and Pietro Carranza, the privy chamberlain, and his friend Giovanni Lopez, bishop of Perugia, and many more. Remolino de Elerdo, the herald, announced Giovanni Vera da Ursula, members of the Sacred College. Frank Braun had been mistaken. All the costumes were tasteful and genuine, and no expense had been spared to reproduce the atmosphere accurately. It was only among the invited guests that one could see very strange interpretations of Renaissance costumes. The whole thing was well managed, and one could see that it had been carefully rehearsed. The guests took their seats on the platform, leaving a large cleared space in the middle of the room where papal guards and serving friars walked to and fro, finally withdrawing into the garden. An organ started to play somewhere far away. The lights were dimmed, leaving the room drenched in a soft, bluish color like moonlight. Suddenly there was singing, and women's soft voices drifted from far away into the silent hall. Frank Braun closed his eyes and listened, trying to remember where he had heard the song before. It must have been long ago, long, long ago. The words of the song were in Latin, and it had been sung by nuns. Yes, the nuns, long ago, the rose nuns on Johannes night. How had it all happened? And he dreamed back through the years, carried back into the past by the chanting of the nuns, and he saw himself again as he had been then. Then. He was a law clerk in a small town on the Rhine. The judge, who was his superior, did not like Frank Braun. In fact, he had disliked him from the first, and his dislike grew with each week and each month. Frank Braun hated the judge as he hated everyone who did not like him. Now he smiled about. The judge had been perfectly right, of course. What had he been given an assistant for? To take over a small part of his work, and naturally the most tedious part. It was not much work at that, 3 or 4 hours a day, and in the evening he was supposed to go to the inn with the judge and keep him company and listen to his stories. One morning a week he had to write the court record, and one night a week he was supposed to play scat at the inn. That was fair and just. That was what his juridical education was for. But Frank Braun did not play scat. He went to the inn once and never again. It bored him, he said. Bored him. Him, the Herr Referendar. He did not pay any social calls either, neither to the mayor, nor to the county councilor, nor to the rector of the church, or the director of the high school. When the judge reproached him for his oversight, he calmly stated that he had met the gentlemen at the inn anyway, and that he did not consider any further acquaintance with them worth his while. Once he wrote the record at a court session, but only once. When he submitted his sheets after the session, the judge became red in the face, then pale, and red again. "What is this supposed to be, sir?" he thundered. "That's my record," Frank Braun replied. The judge slammed the documents down on the table. He would have liked to tear them up, but he could not. The record must always be written during the session. It is an iron rule and cannot be broken. So he had to sign it, groaning pitifully. Finally, he stuttered, white with rage. In my 20 years of experience as a Prussian judge, I've never seen such a mess. The judge was speechless. I think it was very bad myself, Frank Braun announced calmly. The judge was speechless, staring at him, searching for something to say that would hurt him. Finally, he hissed, "Sir, sir, go back to school and learn penmanship." But his young assistant said, "Thanks for the advice. It wouldn't be worthwhile." Frank Braun was absolutely useless as a law clerk. He was always an hour late at court, and he never did what he was supposed to. He forgot everything. He was unreliable and clumsy. He was impossible, simply impossible. It was certainly better if he stayed away from the courtroom altogether. The judge had long ago exhausted his stock of biting comments. Hopeless, he despaired. Absolutely hopeless. But once he had his revenge, he called Frank Braun into his office and gave him a lecture in a friendly, paternal tone. He wanted to talk things over with him calmly, he said. Scene era at studio. What was Frank Braun really thinking, and what should this lead to? Frank Braun said, "I don't think anything. All this simply bores me." And when the judge flew into a rage, when he stormed and scolded and held out all his shortcomings to Frank Braun, methodically, from beginning to end, his assistant said haughtily, "Heavens, Judge, why don't you tell it to the President of the Supreme Court? Why don't you write this into my conduct list?" And now the judge had the upper hand. "Sir," he said, "sir, what do you think of me? I, to spoil your career? I? No, I will give you the same beautiful Model F recommendation that I have given 100 other candidates. Now do what you like. I thank you. You may go now." This was an undisputable victory for the judge, and that was why Frank Braun hated him. The only person with whom he could talk down there was the fat Catholic priest. He used to play chess with Frank Braun. The priest was a connoisseur and a lover of good wines. Like all good Rhinelanders, he drank only Moselle with a glass of Saar or Ruhr wine now and then. He enjoyed developing his young friend's tastes in wines. Yeah, Jesus, Yar? Year, he would ask. 93, Frank Braun said, and the priest nodded. He learned to drink wine and to play chess, and he realized that both were half an art and half a science, and he was convinced that this was the best he could possibly do in this small town on the Rhine. Thus the months slowly went by. "Have you been to see the abbess yet?" the priest kept asking him. Frank Braun shook his head, but each time he vowed that he would certainly go to the Dominican convent the next day. He had promised his mother he would go, and he had promised the priest. He did not forget it, but he just put it off from one day to the next. And the priest scolded him. Once the priest said, "I went to the convent today. The abbess asked me to tell you that you are a very rude young man." Frank Braun blushed. "It is quite true. I'll go there tomorrow." "I am glad you realize it, but you don't need to go there tomorrow. The abbess is inviting you for Sunday night." "Night?" Frank Braun asked in a surprise. The priest nodded. "Yes, night. We are driving over at 10 o'clock when the moon rises. At 10 o'clock the nuns are celebrating their feast of roses." They drove through the June night in the priest's old buggy. The priest himself held the reins, clicking his tongue. "Giddy up, Zolfki, giddy up." He called out to his old mare, and the mare neighed eagerly. "For 8 years I have driven over every year on this night," the priest explained, "ever since Sister Beata became abbess of the convent. Since then, they have been celebrating the Feast of Roses every year." "Only since then?" Frank asked. "So it is she who created it?" "Oh no, it is centuries old, and as old as the convent itself, or slightly less so. The records say that the first abbess, Clara von Pappenheim, created this feast at the beginning of the 15th century. But you see, Doctor, it is no longer in keeping with the times. At least many priests seem to think so. The nuns were not forbidden to hold their feast, but there were hints and veiled suggestions, and so one custom after the other was dropped until only the name was left, Feast of Roses. But our abbess revived it again. What did she do? She resumed all the old customs as they are recorded in the chronicle of the convent, leaving out only a few that were a little too crude. You will see yourself how it is. The church people in Cologne are very much against her. They are afraid that this drinking feast may create annoyance amongst the God-fearing and jeers amongst the heathen. But the abbess is a drost. What is that word? Drost of the Vischerine branch, and three of her kin were abbesses of this convent, and her uncle is the Archbishop of Mainz, and one of her brothers is the Prince Abbot of Trithheim. So they don't like to do anything against her as long as she lives. The roses will blossom here every year on Midsummer Night, St. John's Night. They arrived at the convent at 10 o'clock, and the deaf gardener opened the gate for them. They walked through the spacious garden over a beautiful white gravel path that was bathed in soft moonlight. The priest showed Frank Braun a tall cedar tree whose black silhouette furnished a vivid contrast as outlined against the silver moon. From Lebanon, he said, they say that a young nun who joined the children's crusade of Peter of Amiens, I don't know how to say it, brought it back with her as a little tree, but it isn't true. A drost brought the tree from Lebanon only 150 years ago. He was a cousin of the third abbess of his family. The gardener showed them through the peristyle into the cloister and told them to wait there. The nuns will be here right away, he said, as soon as their devotion is over. Frank Braun looked around. Only a few lamps were lighted in the cloister, but the cloister garth was flooded with moonlight. The floor was covered with great white marble slabs, and everywhere there were roses twined around the columns and reaching high up to the galleries. White roses, thousands of white ones, roses, Jesus. White roses, thousands of white roses. These are all Niphetos and Boule de Neige. Sure, I botched that too. The priest explained, only these three bushes in front here are Francisca Kruger, which I planted 12 years ago. In the cloister garth, 2 long tables had been set with white damask, and before each chair was a plate and a finely cut goblet. There were silver baskets filled with pastry and cookies, and all over the tables, strewn over the tablecloth and growing out of tall crystal vases, were roses, white roses. Between the roses stood demijohns of Venetian glass. They were empty. Soon they will be full of heavy Cyprus wine, the priest explained, pointing to a rose bush. Look over there. Frank Braun saw a good-sized barrel on a wooden pedestal covered with roses, and nestling against it a smaller barrel. The small one is mine, the priest smiled. Burned Castellar Oslis from the high school in Trier. I brought it here because I don't like Cyprus wine. The Cyprus wine is for the women. Your uncle sends it every year from Rome. Who sends it? Frank Braun said wonderingly. My uncle? Your uncle, of course, the Jesuit, the Monsignor. Don't you know the story? Yes, Frank Braun's mother had told him about it, about his uncle who had been a captain in the Hussars and had left the service after the War of 1870. He had gone to Rome and become a Catholic priest. There must have been some connection with the abbess, because that was why his mother had asked him to call on her. But he had scarcely listened, and what little he heard he had forgotten long ago. I had better tell you about it before you see the abbess, the priest said. Come with me. At the end of the cloister, a little table was set for 3 chairs, 3 plates, and 3 glasses. There was also a basket with pastry and a large vase of roses. This is where we sit, the priest said, you and I and the deacon, who is now saying Mass inside. Sit down. He took 2 glasses, went to the small barrel of Moselle wine, and filled them. Drink, doctor, drink. Tonight the roses are blooming. The faint tinkling of the glasses mingled with the sweet notes of a nightingale, which began to sing in the rose bushes, and very softly, far away in the chapel, could be heard the singing of the nuns. Stabit mater spiosa, the priest said. I brought this song to the abbess. She has it sung only once a year, on midsummer night. I told her about Jacopone da Todi. Da Todi. This was the first time Frank Braun heard about the Speciosa and about Jacopone da Todi. I'm sure that's monstrously botched. The priest emptied his glass. They will be here in a few minutes. I'd better get on with my story. He began telling about the abbess, and at his first sentences, Frank Braun remembered what his mother had told him, but he did not interrupt the older man and sat quietly, dreaming amid the perfume of the roses. His uncle had a friend and comrade who was a lieutenant in the same regiment, and this friend had become engaged to Lenore Drost. She was 18 then, young and beautiful. She and her fiancé had grown up together, and his family estate adjoined the ancestral seat of her family. He loved her, and she liked him, but she did not know then what love was. She did not know it then. But she knew it 3 months later when she met the other man, her fiancé's friend, Frank Braun's uncle. They both knew of their mutual love without ever speaking about it. Then came the war, and the hussars went to the front. She said goodbye to her fiancé and wept as he kissed her. But an hour later, the other man came. They did not mean to, but they were in each other's arms and kissed fervently once to last a lifetime. Her fiancé was killed shortly afterwards at Spichern, but the friend came back a captain decorated with the Iron Cross, a radiant hero. The woman he loved was gone. She had taken the veil, and as a Dominican nun, she was doing penance for the kiss that had betrayed her fiancé. She was a Drost. Her kiss had betrayed her fiancé and sharpened the bayonet that killed him. Lenore Drost believed it, and the other man, too. The man she never saw again. He took leave and went to Italy. Then he retired from the army, became a convert to the Catholic faith, and a priest, as she had become a nun. He did it out of a sincere conviction, that was certain, and yet was there any greater way of showing his love for this woman? They both rose in their profession. He became Monsignor, and she the Abbess Beata. They never wrote, but they heard of each other, and now, for many years, he had been sending the cypress wine for the Feast of Roses. That was the story. The deacon stepped out of the vestry door and came over to join them in the cloister. He was a man in his 60s, tall, powerfully built, with white hair and clever eyes. The priest introduced Frank Braun to him and asked if the abbess was coming. They will be here immediately, the deacon answered, emptying a glass to the priest's health. Again, the organ started to play as the doors of the chapel opened. Slowly, 2 by 2, the nuns marched in, each of them carrying a branch with 3 roses. But those roses were not white, they were dark red. The wounds of Christ, the priest explained, signifying also the Trinity, the deacon added, Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, 3, and yet 1. Singing softly, the nuns passed under the columns, out into the moon-flooded cloister garth, and through the white veil of roses drifted Palestrina's unearthly song, Jesu dulcis. I'm not trying to read this. There, you can read it yourself. The sheer beauty of these words, the unbearable beauty of the music. The nuns walked around the long table and stopped, each one behind her chair. Last came the abbess, preceded by an old lay sister, who adjusted the cushions on her throne. The abbess mounted the little step and sat down, signaling the nuns with her branch to take their places at the table. Frank Braun stared at her. She was beautiful, this abbess, with a calm, austere beauty. How old could she be? He counted. 40? No, 37 only. 38, perhaps, and 20 years in the convent. The old lay sister served the guests, keeping their glasses filled with Moselle wine. But at the tables in the cloister garth, 4 young nuns poured dark wine from the shiny decanters, which they filled from the barrel. Then, upon a sign from the abbess, they all rose and prayed. It was a short prayer, prayed in silence. Silently, the abbess lifted her glass, and silently she emptied it. The nuns followed her example. Again, Abbess Beata beckoned with her rose branch, and one of the young nuns rose from the table and stepped into the center of the cloister garth. Now comes the story of Jesus' marvelous love, the love that never ceases, the priest explained. They say that the first Drost wrote it. For centuries it was spoken in Latin, but our abbess has translated it into German. Sister Agnes is going to recite it. The young nun began, half talking, half singing. She spoke of Jesus' love that was so much greater, so much deeper than the human brain could fathom, and even if a soul were weighed down with gravest sin, it could be saved if the sinner repented before the Lord Jesus. For 7 years the knight Tannhäuser had consorted in the Horselberg with the she-devil Venus, enmeshed in a net of blackest sin. But at last he had freed himself and made the pilgrimage to Rome to do penance. He knelt before Pope Urban and kissed the tip of his fingers, confessing everything he had done and praying for absolution. But the Holy Father waxed wroth at the enormity of the sinner's wickedness and refused to grant it. There was no salvation for Tannhäuser, who he would have to burn in darkest hell, damned in all eternity. Angrily, the Pope pushed his crooked staff into the ground and said that not until this old wand should bear blossoms would there be hope for the knight. The whole chorus of nuns sang the Pope's cruel answer. Not ere life in this wood will show, ere from this staff a rose will grow, not before. And again the knight fell down on his knees, kissed the Holy Father's feet, and sobbed greatly, again praying for absolution. But the Pope repeated his relentless no. Not ere the world turns round in space, ere earth and sky reverse their place, not before. And a third time the knight fell to his knees and kissed the dust before the Pope's feet, moaning and weeping piteously. But the Holy Father persisted in his just anger and bade him be gone from the holy place that had been defiled by his presence, bade him to go back whence he had come and where he belonged, to the evil witch Venus in the Horselberg. Never could Tannhäuser obtain absolution from his sins. Never! Not ere winter comes at summertime, ere it snows roses and rains wine, not before. In despair the knight rose from the floor, took up his staff, and left the Pope's great hall, and everyone stepped back from him, for whose poor soul there was no salvation from hell. But at night a wondrously beautiful boy appeared to the Pope in his dreams. Take your staff and follow me, the boy said as he disappeared in the gardens of the Pope's palace. Pope Urban awoke and saw that it was bright morning. While he was being dressed, he remembered his dream and asked for his staff. As he wanted to walk in his gardens, the valet brought the Pope's crooked staff, and the Holy Father took it and walked down the steps of his palace. He went on into his garden, and as he passed the fig trees laden with ripe fruit, he felt a desire to eat some of the luscious figs. He stuck his staff into the ground and went around the trees, breaking off the choicest fruits and eating them. Here the young nun interrupted her recital while a lay sister brought her an old stick in the shape of a crooked staff. Sister Agnes pushed the stick against the marble floor, pretending to stick it into the ground. I can't stop saying lady for lay. The old lay sister held it in this position while Sister Agnes walked around the cloister, acting as if she were breaking fruit from the trees and eating. Meanwhile, the other nuns formed a circle around the staff. Then Sister Agnes returned and continued her recital. And the Pope came back to the spot where he had pushed his staff into the ground but could not find it. The staff had disappeared, and in its place he saw a rose bush that was grown exactly into the shape of the Pope's pastoral staff. The bush bore only a few young green leaves and 3 small rosebuds. The nuns opened the circle, and Sister Agnes found her staff again, which the nuns had decorated meanwhile with rose garlands and with 3 small rosebuds. And the Holy Father walked on through his garden, and it seemed to him that in the dazzling sunlight a young lad was walking ahead of him, beckoning him to follow. Pope Urban came to a small circular pond, and as he gazed into the water, he saw the pine trees mirrored in the clear surface. They seemed to grow downward into the depths of the pool, and in its furthest depth he could see the bright sky with light, fluffy clouds passing across. Here Sister Agnes again interrupted her chant. Followed by the nuns, she walked over to the little pool in the corner of the cloister garth. "Let's go over there," the deacon said. "This part is particularly beautiful." One of the nuns had a small cardboard box which she opened carefully. "I provide the actor," the priest whispered to Frank Braun. "One of the children in my confirmation class gets me one every year. Formerly, he used to live in a cigar box for a few days until he was ready for the feast, but the nuns thought that was cruel. They thought that perhaps he did not like the smell. Now I put him into a soap box. Apparently, he prefers that odor." The nun took a little frog from the box and put it on the palm of Sister Agnes's hand. The little frog sparkled golden green in the moonlight. Sister Agnes's white hand trembled slightly. "He is cold," she said, but immediately she fell back into her role and continued her recital. The Holy Father sat at the edge of the pool as a small frog jumped into his open hand. "He's going to bolt," a bright voice cried, unmistakably Austrian, in a cadence. "She is a Metternich, I can't read. All right, let me take a drink. Try to regroup and read these last 5 pages before I fall asleep. My hand trembled. "He is cold," the father said at the edge of the pool. "He's going to bolt," a bright voice cried, unmistakably Austrian in cadence. "She is a Metternich," the priest explained, "from Vienna." The little green frog did not wait for his cue. He hopped, plop, into the water. With ahs and ohs, the nuns pressed, bending down to see him. The little frog dived, swimming away quickly from the grass that overhung the edge of the pool, past the pillars with rose garlands that were mirrored in the water. He swam toward the moon and the stars, down into the sparkling sky, away from the earth to the sky. Everyone's interest was centered in the frog, and no one paid attention to the nun's recital. Her little frog acted exactly as the frog in her story had done, only that the Pope's frog had swum through the shining sunlight, disappearing somewhere in the depths of the pool down in the sky. I could see him, the nun who had been a Princess Metternich chuckled. Look, here he is. The nuns went back again and took their places in a circle around Sister Agnes. She told how Pope Urban had fallen thoughtful, and how he had ordered that 100 messengers be sent out on swift horses to ride through the country and bring the knight Tannhäuser back to the castle of the angels. She told how the Pope had sat on his high throne deeply lost in thought, without eating or drinking, and without speaking a word. But that night was St. John's night, and he had promised the Dominican sisters to be their guest. It was the first time that he went to celebrate with them the Feast of the Roses in honor of the Lord Jesus. As he entered the cloister of their convent, little white roses snowed down on him, and wine was sprinkled upon him from above, while the sisters sang, The dear Lord's love worketh wonders passing great. It causeth snow to fall in summertime. The Lord transformeth rain to golden wine, and showereth roses from the heaven's gate. Sister Agnes did not speak these verses. They were sung by the full chorus of nuns, and Frank Braun noticed suddenly that there were 12 nuns standing up in the galleries. Some of them had cups into which they dipped their fingers and sprinkled wine upon those below, so that it looked like golden dewdrops. Others dropped roses, many white roses that snowed down upon the sisters from above. Then the nuns stopped singing, and Sister Agnes finished her tale. She did not tell, however, what happened to the poor knight. She told only how the Pope had knelt down with the nuns and had prayed to the Lord Jesus, and her poem ended with a triumphant song of praise to the heart of Jesus, whose pure love embraces all creatures and is much deeper than the human brain can fathom. The abbess beckoned Sister Agnes to come over and kneel before her throne. The abbess said a few kind words to her and patted her cheek. Then the nuns took their places at the table, again sipped their wine, and munched sweets. There was a whispering and chuckling and chattering and soft laughter that sounded gaily through the cloister like the laughter of young girls in a boarding school during recess. The abbess rose. Let us sing, sisters, she said. 4 nuns rose from the table, an older one, 2 young nuns, and a little novice. They took their places under a porticus that was overgrown with roses. The older nun beat the time with her rose branch, and the 4 nuns sang, and I'm not going to try to read this, although it seems fairly easy. The nuns took it up, and their bright voices rang through the moonlit night. In den Rasen, Jesus Wein ist aufget. I'm not trying to read this. Don't like reading phrases that I can't translate. They stopped, then the abbess rose to her feet. Let us drink, dear sisters, to the love of the bridegroom. She drained her glass, and the nuns followed her example. Pour the wine, she cried. Pour the cypress wine. Sister Clara raised her rose branch, and the novice alone sang. She was hardly more than a child, young and slender. Her voice sounded like liquid moonlight, like rain in May, like white rose petals scattered by Columbine. There's another phrase. Tee, tee, ta, ta, it echoed in the colonnades, and the nightingale took up the note. Too, 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 too. It came back like a flute. The abbess beckoned to her, answer, and the sweet novice sang louder with a fuller voice. In den Rosen, and louder and fuller came back the nightingale's answer. Too, 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 too. Once more sharp and clear like hoofs on shining marble slabs, and again almost dying, painful and mournful like a farewell to life. And always the nightingale answered, The nun sobbed, and two great tears dropped from the priest's eyes. "This is so beautiful," he said, "so beautiful." But the deacon whispered, "Yes, and very pagan," but in his eyes there was also a moist shimmer. The abbess stood up. "He is in our midst, Jesus, the God of love." She took her glass, held it with outstretched arms, and sang with the nuns, "In den Rosen." They touched their glasses and drank, and all the nuns sang the last verse. Read it yourself. The deacon rose also from the table with the priest and Frank Braun, and they joined in singing the refrain, "En den in den Rosen." The old lay sister filled their glasses, and at the long tables out in the cloister garth, the little novices and young sister Ursula hurried busily around with the demijohns, keeping the glasses filled. The nuns drank and sang. The abbess beckoned the priest to her table and welcomed him. "Tell them about the nightingale, father," she smiled, "when you make up your report for Cologne." "I shall certainly do that," the priest smiled. He called Frank Braun over and introduced him to the abbess. She said, "So this is he." She asked him about his mother and his other relatives. She did not mention his uncle. He answered, but he formed the words with his lips only. He could not drink. All his emotion was concentrated in his eyes. He saw. There she was, sitting on her throne, a tall, beautiful woman, kind and saintly and serious, dead to life. He saw only her hands and the oval of her face. Everything else was covered by the severe folds of her black and white habit. The white roses formed a curtain behind her, but in her lap she held red roses. Her small hand was playing with them. A saint's hand, small, sweet, roundish, and shining blue eyes. She had his glass filled with cypress wine and drank with him. Then he knelt before her, knelt down on both knees on the step of her throne. Something drew him there, forcing him to kneel. He thought, "Now I must ask for her blessing," but he did not say a word. The abbess raised her hands and touched his temples lightly with the tips of her fingers. Looking at him silently, it seemed like an eternity to him. "Just like him," she murmured, "just like him." She lifted up his head and bent down to him. She kissed his forehead and kissed both his eyes. 3 kisses, then lightly, oh, ever so lightly, she pushed him back, rose, and held out her branch to him. "Go," she said, "go." He took the branch with the blood-red roses and got to his feet, stumbling as he retreated a few steps. And now he found himself standing beside the priest and the deacon, who talked fast in a low voice. Frank Braun did not hear what they said. He stared at the most beautiful woman. Was it not the Mother of God who had kissed him? The abbess quickly stepped down from her throne and walked through the porticus, with all the nuns following her. There was a great silence in the spacious cloister. Only the moon shone on the marble slabs, and everywhere, on all sides, there was the white sea of roses. A sparkling, gleaming white. "Is the feast over?" Frank Braun whispered. The priest said ordinarily it wouldn't be, but tonight I am afraid it is over. He took Frank Braun's left arm and the deacon his right. Together they led him out through the cloister, but at the last pillars he stopped. "One moment," he pleaded, "just one more." He looked back. Roses, roses, white roses, and moonlight. A glass had been knocked over. Cypress wine flowed over the gleaming marble. The wine looked like black blood, and the nightingale sobbed. He grasped the deacon's hand. "Reverend," he whispered, "say something, speak, say something. I must hear your voice. I must know if all this is real." "Yes, yes," the deacon assured him, "it is real. But come now, young friend." They walked through the convent garden and out by the small gate. They got into the priest's buggy and drove across country. First through the birch forest and over the wooden bridge across the Angerbach to bring the deacon home. Frank Braun heard nothing and saw nothing. He was dreaming of the cloister as it looked when the nuns were fleeing from from it, of the gleaming marble floor and the roses on which the moon shone. The deacon is right, the priest said. That was the last feast of the roses that the Rhenish nuns will ever hold. Hello, bruvs. But why? Why? The priest shook his head slowly. It was a sin that time when the Baroness Lenore Drost kissed her fiance's friend, and she repented the sin and took the veil. She repented her sin for 20 years until he urged, Father, tell me, please, until tonight, amidst wine and roses, the abbess Beata kissed her friend's nephew, or rather, her friend himself, and that was a worse sin still. He whispered, it was a sin. A sin? Not to you, and not to me, perhaps not even to the deacon, who is stricter than I am, but it will seem a great sin to Abbess Beata. A kiss betrayed the fiancé of her life, and tonight the fiancé of her soul, Jesus, her Savior, was again betrayed by her with a kiss. Yes, this was certainly the last feast of roses. The people in Cologne need not worry any more on that score. What shall I do? Frank Braun asked in a shaking voice. The kindly priest patted his cheek. You? You cannot do anything. Sleep well and pray for a saintly woman. Frank Braun did not dream that night. He slept soundly, but the next morning he went again to see the priest. I can help her, he said. I will do what my uncle has done. I will become a Catholic. The priest looked at him silently, but with shining eyes. Slowly he nodded and shook hands with the young man. I will become a Catholic, Frank Braun repeated, but he forgot it later. That's going to be about the halfway point of this long chapter, so I'm done. All right, Brobs, that's all. Anybody got any last words? Speak up if you got something to say. Something. Hello? All right, Brobs, that's all.